Hi everybody. So today we are seeing about the eighth cranial nerve, that is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, as you can see, is kind of distinct because it's actually two nerves. It is vestibular nerve and cochlear nerve. Uh, they travel together, but they have two different functions and pathways altogether. But both of them are entirely sensory. So it's a purely sensory cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear. And as you can see in this diagram, in this slide, the vestibulocochlear nerve fibers, they are all reaching into the brainstem. In fact, to the medulla as well as the pons, because both there will be nuclei or functional components lying in the lower pons as well as the medulla. And thereafter, we can see even the 9, 10, 11, and 12th cranial nerves, all of them will have functional components in the medulla. So from the vestibulocochlear nerve, we can see there are functional components of the 9, 10, 11, 12, along with the vestibular nuclei in the medulla. So let's see it in detail about what is about the vestibulocochlear. In this diagram, you can see the motor and sensory. Since we are talking about the vestibular cochlear nerve, it's only sensory. So you can see these fibers which are coming from the inner ear, which is represented here. So these blue fibers are the sensory. So you can see there are two different nerves coming. One is coming from here, the cochlea, and another is coming from this vestibule part. So the cochlear nerve, the vestibular nerve, both are actually having two different pathways because they have to connect to two different functional components. As I told you, they are carrying two different functions. So that is situated. This is the cochlear nuclei. You have two groups of cochlear nuclei. One is ventral and dorsal in the lower pons. Some part of it may be extending into the very upper part boundary of the medulla. Whereas the vestibular nuclei is a much more bigger nuclei, and it is got four subdivisions, and it extends down to the medulla clearly. Here we can see the stria medullaris, which is kind of a boundary between the pons and the medulla. So the cochlear nuclei and the functional nuclei of the component of the vestibular, they are kind of in the border of both pons and medulla. The uh, the origin. So since this is a sensory nerve, I would say these are fibers that are the fibers are beginning from the sensory receptors. So the sensory receptor of the hearing, as we know, is lying in the organ of Corti, or the organ of Corti is the sensory receptor of hearing, which is lying in the cochlea of the inner ear. So from here, this is a part of the cochlea which is seen here, and from the modulus, the spiral ganglion arises these fibers which are coming out as the cochlear nerve. And then you can see the vestibular fibers. They are coming from different areas of the middle ear. In inner ear. That is because the sensory receptors have kinetic as well as static receptors, which are situated in the uh, macula and the crista, which are lying in the utricle saccule and the ampulla of the semicircular canal. So that is why you have all these different origins. But then they will merge together as one vestibular nerve, and then vestibular nerve fibers, along with the cochlear nerve fibers, come out of the ear or the through the internal acoustic meatus as two different nerves, yes, but they travel out together. Along with the facial nerve, we will see the labyrinthine vessels. So, coming to the details, the functional component is special somatic afferent. So, these functional component nuclei are lying in the pons as well as medulla, as I told you, uh, kind of in the junction between these two. We'll see the cochlear are carrying the sensory sensations of hearing. The vestibular are carrying the sensory of equilibrium from the inner ear. So it is like two different components. The vestibular component carries the impulses that are responsible for maintaining the body posture, the balance of the muscles, tone of the muscles, the coordination of the head and eye, neck movements. Uh, so it's a very wide, distribution. Coming to the cochlear, it's purely for hearing. So it all comes out, as we can see here in this diagram also, it comes out of the internal acoustic meatus, and then we can see it traveling towards the brainstem, that is in the cerebellopontine angle. It runs and enters into the pontomedullary groove, that is kind of above the olive. So that is how it enters the brainstem. So coming to the uh, pathway. So let's say we have the auditory pathway first, or talk about the hearing signals. These are coming from the spinal ganglion of the cochlea, and from the spinal ganglion, the cochlear fibers, they will come to the uh, cochlear nuclei, as I told you, dorsal and ventral in the pons. So that is where the second order neuron begins, and from there, many of these fibers will cross through the trapezoid body and form the lateral lemniscus. Some of these fibers may not cross at this level, but they will go up to the superior olivary nucleus in the midbrain, and then they will cross from there. And finally, the second order neurons, they will reach to the inferior colliculus, or they will pass through the inferior colliculus of the midbrain, and from there they are connected to the medial geniculate body close to the thalamus. That is where the final pathway or the neurons will begin as auditory radiation, and they will reach to the superior temporal gyrus in the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, where you have the auditory cortex lying. So that is how the ultimate pathway of the cochlear fibers of this nerve passes. Now, uh, the cochlear nuclei, as seen in this diagram, is lying very closely related to this inferior cerebellar peduncle in the medulla. So dorsal is lying behind it, and ventral cochlear nuclei is lying in front of it. So that is with regard to the cochlear nuclei. Coming to the vestibular fibers, so the pathways, they are starting from the vestibular ganglion in the inner ear. So as I told you, from the receptors of lying in the saccule, the utricle, the ampulla of the semicircular canals. So from there, these fibers will rise through the vestibular ganglion, and they will come through the internal acoustic meatus with the facial nerve, and they will pass, as we just mentioned before, through the cerebellopontine ankle till they reach to the um, brainstem. So in the brainstem, as I told you, there is a very large function nuclei of vestibular, and that is divided into four subdivisions: superior, lateral, medial, inferior, lying in the pons as well as medulla. From there, the second order neuron begins, and the second order neuron will then carry these signals to the uh, different destinations. So some of these pathways, some of these fibers from the vestibular nuclei will pass directly into the descending tracts, or as vestibulospinal tract to the spinal cord. Some of them will go to the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Now, this is very important. We will see it further ahead to understand how it is important. Then most of the fibers has to go to the cerebellum, because that is where we have the higher center for coordination, balance, equilibrium, muscle tone, coordination, all that. So many of these fibers will pass from the medulla through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum. flocculonodular lobe, which is the archicerebellum. So then we have a fourth group, which will have to go, of course, to the cerebrum, that is through the thalamus. So a very few fibers will have the connection to the cerebral cortex uh, through the thalamus, so ventral portion. But as this vestibular pathway and fibers are mainly responsible for carrying impulses regarding equilibrium, balance, we will see that cerebellum plays a more important role. So many of the fibers have to reach to the cerebellum. Uh, some of these pathways from the vestibular fibers may, as we see, some of them are going further up and then coming down to the cerebellum. But most of them will pass through this inferior cerebellar peduncle directly to the cerebellum. Okay, so the medial longitudinal fasciculus, as I told you, is a very important part because this is the part which helps to coordinate between the head, neck, and eye movements to the auditory stimulus or any other stimulus. So, therefore, this is a very important coordination tract. So oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, these all nerves are responsible for the conjugal eye movements. So of course, conjugal eye movements, and then movement of the head, that is the neck muscles. All of these are possible because of the connections or the pathways passing through the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So there is, of course, a very important function carried through this medial longitudinal fasciculus. Then, as I told you, the efferent path, a few fibers are going directly from the vestibular nuclei to the spinal cord as vestibulospinal tracts. So they will, of course, be connecting to the different connections through the spinal cord. So coming to the vestibular cortex, yes, most of the functions of balance and equilibrium are being maintained in the archicerebellum, but the higher center, of course, we have some in the cerebrum located in the postcentral gyrus. So there is a sensory homunculus where we have the motor homunculus and sensory homunculus, which are lying in the uh, mm, cerebrum, and the sensory is lying in the post-central gyrus. So we can see these are responsible for integrating the cerebellar and other pathways. Uh, so uh, that is also an important connection. So coming to the summary of this vestibular cochlear nerve, the it is two different functions. One is purely for auditory signals, another is for the equilibrium and balance or muscle tone, etc. So the functional component of hearing, so that is special somatic afferent of the hearing functional component, is lying in the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, which is related to the inferior cerebellar peduncle um, in the medulla as well as junction of the pons or the lower pons. So the fibers we said begins from the spiral ganglion, which is extending from the modulus of the cochlea, and then it will pass uh, through the internal acoustic meatus into the through the posterior cranial fossa, through the cerebellopontine angle into the pontomedullary groove above the olive, and then it comes relates to these cochlear nuclei from which the second order neuron begins, and it passes uh, most of it will pass by crossing at that level itself as the lateral lemniscus to the higher center, and some will pass above and then cross at a higher level of the midbrain. All these fibers will pass through the inferior colliculus and immediately come to the medial geniculate body. So that is where the final order of neurons will emerge as auditory radiations, which will reach to the uh, auditory cortex lying in the superior temporal gyrus or the temporal lobe. So that is the destination of the cochlear fibers carrying hearing signals. With regard to the vestibular, we know it is from the vestibular ganglion, receptors lying in the saccule, the utricle, the ampulla of the semicircular canals. So from all there, the vestibular fibers will carry these signals of balance. They will come along with this cochlear nerve through the internal acoustic meatus, posterior cranial fossa, cerebellopontine angle, the pontomedullary groove into the uh, pons and medulla, where the vestibular nuclei is long extended for subdivisions. And from the vestibular nuclei, the next order of neurons will pass into different pathways. Some will go directly to the spinal cord as a efferent response, as a vestibulospinal tract. Some will go to the MLF, that is the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the brainstem, which is very important for the head, neck, and eye muscle coordination. Then most of the fibers will go to the cerebellum, which is the higher center for equilibrium and muscle tone, voluntary muscle coordination, etc. So that is through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. From the medulla, it passes to the cerebellum, and some fibers will have to go to the cerebrum. So that is passing through the thalamus ventroposteral nucleus and reaches to the cerebrum, where there is a higher center of the head in the postcentral gyrus. So that is help. That is how the vestibulocochlear or the vestibular part of that nerve is carrying these signals. So this is the basic information about the vestibular cochlear nerve, as it carries two different functions. It is a very important cranial nerve with important functions. Hope you could understand the basic details about the vestibular and cochlear part fibers of the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. Thank you. So